Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to the first lecture of the spring 2019 semester. We're really lucky to start this series with Eric Höweler. Eric is joining us from Boston, where he's an associate professor in architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and along with Mi Jin Yoon, a principal in the Boston-based practice Höweler Yoon Architecture. Höweler Yoon has an enormous collection of projects internationally, an extensive list of honors and awards, including Progressive Architecture Award, Architecture Records Design Vanguard Award, and the Architecture League's Emerging Voices Award. Now, I'm super thrilled personally that Eric could join us, but I think it's also a particularly tricky thing to introduce Eric and his work, and that's one of the things that I think makes his practice so important. By that I mean that you may notice tonight that the projects that we'll see in the following lecture are carrying on conversations with a host of what we might call architecture's tendencies, or what Jeff might actually call architecture's tendencies. And more often than not, the work is not only participating in these conversations, but offering really canonical works within each of these contemporary disciplinary conversations. And yet, at the same time, the work always manages to resist being totalized by any one of these individual tendencies. So for example, prior to founding Höweler Yoon, Eric was an associate principal at KPF, leading several very large building projects like the 118-story International Commerce Center in Hong Kong. In 2000, he wrote 1001 Skyscrapers with Mi Jin Yoon, and in 2003, he wrote Skyscraper Vertical Now. And at the GSD, he teaches courses on steel construction technologies with a focus on tall buildings. So certainly much of Eric's work with Höweler and Yoon could be understood as advancing contemporary conversations on tall building typologies. But Höweler Yoon's prolific work on the skyscraper as a type is paralleled by a body of work that's so small that it challenges the scalar conventions of what constitutes architecture at all. These very small things include bespoke circuit boards, kinetic urban furniture, and computational swings. But while this parallel body of work consists of things almost too small to call architecture, is responsible, in my opinion, for evolving architecture's conversations on digital technology through the introduction of hardware and physical sensing into discourses that have historically been preoccupied with software and screens. This innovative work is paralleled by another body of work, a collection of projects that demonstrates the office's commitment to material innovation and experimental understanding of craft. These projects include everything from do-it-yourself injected molded pop-up libraries to CNC-carved compression-only structures. So I think you see where I'm going with this. That is that every time you think you've found a thread through which you can organize the office's prolific output, you find something else that not only frustrates your understanding of the work, but is leading an entirely new conversation somewhere else altogether. This resistance to being totalized by a singular discourse is one of the imperatives of what Eric and Mi Jin have called expanded practice, which is also the title of the office's 2009 monograph. Now, in a really straightforward sense, I think this is an enormously clever way for them to organize their work. Basically, it guarantees that you're always invited to the party, but you can always leave when you get bored. That's to say that there's always something about their resistance to these totalizing discourses that allows Höweler Yoon to continually recalibrate their engagement with contemporary moment. But beyond that, it also suggests that lurking beneath these diverse individual strands of research, Höweler Yoon's most experimental project is perhaps a kind of meta-project of the office itself, a continually expanded practice that serves as a lens through which we can all glimpse a contemporary architectural moment in which architecture itself seems to be comprised of increasingly diverse collection of non-totalizing conversations. And to me, this notion of Höweler Yoon, the organization, as a continually experimental design project seems like the right thing to keep in the back of your mind as you're seeing the work tonight. Because it's not only this meta-project that underwrites the enormous diversity of ideas that we'll see tonight, but it also suggests a more generous and perhaps even more experimental way to be an architect today. And in that sense, Höweler Yoon is an ongoing project that all of us who are trying to be architects today should be super grateful for. So with that, let's welcome Eric Höweler.
Thanks, Curtis. It's true, we're sort of confused about the particular tendencies or discourses that we're participating in. We're just trying to sort of figure things out. So I called this lecture signal to noise, which is a term we're testing out. Signal to noise is a ratio between when a kind of a signal or broadcast is sent out and at the moment where it becomes sort of perceived or understood or decoded by a receiver. And so borrowing that term from communication theory, we thought we might think about architecture as a broadcast medium, as a kind of form of mass media, and think about the question of signal and noise as a way to think about the contemporary moment. Maybe in our sort of world of cultural production. We're sort of trying to send out signals in a cloud of noise, a kind of background of noise. Maybe we can use that to think about what it means to practice today. It's also a good idea to sort of test out an idea for a book or a title for a book by doing a lecture. So we've been using this title as a lecture, sort of test drive, and it's a book that we're currently working on for the studio. But signal to noise as a concept, how do we use that? How do we think about architecture as broadcast or as signal? And you can't help but think about, specifically about architecture and its audiences. And what are those audiences? How are they receiving the work? How is the other noise sort of surrounding the reception of your work? And how might we think about a sort of contemporary moment in a kind of state of distraction? You know, what does technology have to offer these young ladies in the, it looks like the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, something so compelling on their screens that they couldn't even look at the Night Watch Rembrandt behind them. And so this seems to be increasingly our kind of our new normal. And how does architecture sort of compete with this? How does it either engage with these technologies? How does it use these technologies to disseminate itself? Or how might it become part of this background noise? If you think about architecture as broadcast or as mass media, you might think about the Gothic Cathedral as a kind of form of mass media, as a kind of state-of-the-art sort of architecture of persuasion, where if you enter a cathedral, the columns are attenuated to the point where they're almost dissolved. The quality of light is coming through. It's producing special effects, and that might sort of conspire with the music and the smells and the sounds, and it might sort of inspire you to sort of believe in something. And so architecture, if we think about it in those terms, might be, in a contemporary way, also a form of mass media, a form of persuasion, or a form of communication that aspires to reach a sort of greater audience. Now, Walter Benjamin, who sort of wrote about the metropolis in the early 20th century, described the kind of phantasmagoria of sort of walking through the city, and he identified new sort of protagonists within this modern city. The flaneur, the dandy, the window shopper, and he described architecture as always being received in a state of distraction. And so I like to think about Walter Benjamin's sort of Paris in the 1930s, and then I think about Times Square, and I imagine how does that flaneur sort of fit into Times Square, and what would that flaneur think about Times Square if he was distracted and sort of bombarded by commercial communication in the 1930s? How might he receive the sort of the contemporary moment today? But if we look at the history of architecture, and here's a skyscraper, skyscraper as a sort of form of broadcast, the PSFS building with its logo at the top, using a kind of architecture to brand a corporation, that's a form of mass media. And then we get the more kind of explicit sort of architecture of display, of presentation, kind of billboard architecture. So this idea that architecture is sort of struggling to communicate something, that it's sort of trying to find its audiences, whether it's sort of communicating through iconography, through brick, or whether it's communicating through light, it is always trying to message something. And increasingly, those messages are sort of being sort of mixed. And so when Prince died, all these buildings turned purple, and everyone said, "Isn't that nice?" Everyone changed their buildings purple for Prince. It turns out it was the Queen's birthday, and so purple wasn't Prince, it was actually the Queen. And so as architecture becomes sort of augmented by the capacity for it to start to communicate through a kind of very low definition signal of color and maybe sound, some of the signals are getting lost in this sort of superabundance of imagery. And so this is actually the building I worked on, a 118-story ICC tower in Hong Kong, which is now a 118-story display screen. So this was something that was anticipated by some sort of visionary filmmakers like this slide from Blade Runner. But increasingly, I think architecture is becoming more and more a kind of interface. So it's not just a billboard, it's actually a kind of interface. It's a screen through which we interact with the world. It separates us from them, inside from outside. And increasingly, we have expectations of architecture that it should respond to us, that it should acknowledge us, that it should do more for us. So how do we think about architecture and the city with this kind of new enhanced or augmented capacity for every user and every individual to connect, to communicate, to broadcast, to post, to link. But there's still something about the public realm that is unpredictable, that is maybe accidental, and that's something that is hard to reproduce through all the network devices that you might have. The capacity for people to be alone in the city, to be together in the city, to sort of form collectives, to form publics, to sort of gather, to communicate back to government, to sort of seize a kind of political power that may be only available in the public realm, in space, as well as in the media. These gatherings are, I would say, governed by a set of codes, and some of those codes are sort of explicit, like the kind of do's and don'ts of something like this. But there's also kind of implicit codes of like when is personal space too close, and when is someone standing a little bit too close. And something like personal space, it's something that you don't really study in school maybe, but it is something that we think is, in a way, the kind of starting point for our architectural practice. When Mijin was starting to teach at MIT, her first project was this defensible dress, which basically defined a kind of personal space realm around her body, with the idea that technology could produce a dress that would be architectural. It's not fashion, it's not clothing, it's architecture, because it's really about the sort of definition and the calibration of a spatial, cultural, social environment, an intimate architecture around the body. And so this was our first project, 2001. And we, because Mijin was at MIT, we were starting to be interested in how these technologies could help us think about architecture differently. In 2004, we completed this project for the Athens Olympics, which was a competition to transform an urban plaza at the base of the Acropolis into a field of light and sound. And we sort of launched into this unfamiliar territory with microcontrollers and LED lights. We said, what if the field responded to the user and simply acknowledged that the user was sort of passing through the field? So this is a video from 2004, before every iPhone, or before an iPhone. So this was captured on a video camera. I think we actually had tape of this, but people moving through a field of fiber optics from back to front, from left to right. And this idea that you would sort of move through the field and it would emit white noise and it would emit white light. And the sound of the white noise would sort of mask the sound of the city. And we thought maybe we could make space or place simply with sound and light. This was a kind of ambition in 2004. What we learned is that people sort of went into this field and were somehow stimulated by it, enjoyed the kind of responsiveness to the electronic responsiveness, and then they refused to leave. And so they just sort of went in there and got stuck. And so our idea about building a kind of behavior through electronics was sort of frustrated by human behavior, which was actually, more curious, less likely to behave how we sort of imagined them. So this was a kind of early project in electronics, in sort of space making, place making, through a kind of most minimal material. But what we argued was that the media of this interactive space was, in a way, the medium for this type of architecture, of urban space making. Recently, we were asked to do a project on the U.S.-Mexico border, and so we continue to do these kind of interactive, communicative projects. Our client was the General Services Administration, which is the federal government, and they were building a border crossing on the Mexico-U.S. border in San Isidro. And so we said, well, what's happening there? People are waiting to come in. Sometimes they wait for 6 hours to come across the border. And what are they doing? They're sort of looking through their windshields at the border crossing. And we said maybe what we could do is we could take, in a way, the signals of the car passing through the border and sort of broadcast that. And so this concept was basically, we'll have a display. Every time a car goes through, we'll create a kind of flash of light and it'll dissipate. And we'll basically mark the passage of people across the border on this display. Simple idea. It's really a screen. It's a screen that's 1 pixel high and about 600 feet long. And so with the federal government as our client, we installed that strip of light across the top there. And if you go to the San Isidro border, you would see that strip of light, every time a car goes through, a flash of light. And so when you're sitting in your car waiting to cross the border, you're like, is anyone moving? Yes, they are. I can see them moving. What does it do? Maybe it acknowledges the flow across the border. Maybe it acknowledges that the border is pervious, that it's porous. And maybe in this time of like xenophobia and kind of racism, maybe this idea of a border wall as a kind of impenetrable membrane to protect the U.S., maybe this idea of porosity and acknowledging flow and normalizing flow might be some sort of antidote to this kind of hysteria that we see today. Okay, so we have been working in this mode of like electronics and signals, behavior, and politics. Another sort of chapter in the book is looking at what we call means and methods, like the more traditional, how do we make architecture, how does architecture communicate through its kind of materials. So a few years ago, we were invited to do a project in China. We were sent this drawing, which looked like an axonometric. It turns out it was a plan. It's really a parallelogram plan. They said, how would you like to design Site G? And Site G will house a corporate retreat. And they said there's only two conditions. It must be a Chinese courtyard house, and it must have a sloped roof. I said, fine. So we studied the Chinese courtyard house, and we acknowledged that, you know, in the Chinese garden, there's the figure of the pavilion, and there's a field of the architecture. The architecture becomes a kind of frame, and so that sort of figure-field relationship is inverted in these particular garden types. We sort of naively interpreted the courtyard section as this, and we proposed this. And when we presented it, we were quite pleased. We thought we'd sort of achieved the brief. We did a courtyard house, and these are our collaborators. That's our scheme there. We presented this, and the client basically nearly fired us all. He said, these are not Chinese courtyard houses. I don't recognize them as Chinese. All you guys go back and start again. So in China, when you present to the client, they tell you if you pass or you didn't pass. It's kind of like school. It's pass-fail. So we all failed. And the client told us to go back to the drawing boards. He sent us to look at Chinese gardens. He said, look at this. I want you to get that Chinese feeling. And we said, what's that? How do we study that? How do we research that? How do we draw that? And so we tried really hard to sort of understand what it is about this particular scene. What's the relationship of the architecture to the open space, to the landscape, to the vegetation, to the views of the sky, and so on. He also sent us to the Erme Mountains to climb this mountain, and they got us up before dawn. They marched us up to the top of this hill, and they said, okay, over there, you see that fog stuff over there? That's Chinese feeling. That. You can't draw it, but that's what it is. Can you make your architecture out of that? So we went back to our drawing boards, and we worked on it, and we worked on it, and we really tried this time to make something a little bit more responsive to the context in which we were working. I think initially we were sort of working at a kind of an arm's length from the context. We did develop drawings. We submitted the drawings for the building and the details. And then we waited. We waited for about 6 months and didn't hear anything from them. And then 6 months later, we got an email saying, hey, the good news is the project's starting again. We've changed the site, and we've changed the program. Now it's a restaurant. But we thought we'd mirror your plan because the site looks different. So we mirrored your plan. And by the way, it's already under construction. So, so this is China. You're trying to catch up with the client who's sort of working at a different pace. So we quickly looked at our drawings and we went out to the site. And in fact, it was under construction. This was our old site plan. Remember Site G? This is a new site, so they basically mirrored it, and we sort of shoved it back in there. So we sort of adjusted it, got it to fit again. And so the new plan was this one. And then we sort of got it to work. The program changed again. They made it an exhibition hall. It still works. And then we started sending Rhino models back and forth. We were sending them drawings, asking for, could we get a transfer here, maybe. And then, in fact, they started building it based on those, very crude drawings and a bunch of emails back and forth. In China, they build it almost the way you've drawn it. So it's not less is more, it's more or less. It's like more or less what you've got. So it looked a little bit like our drawings. They asked us, what would you like it to be clad in? And we said, what about that Chinese brick, the gray brick? And the windows, we proposed to make them out of wood. And they said, how about Corten? I said, fine. So it was really collaborative. They had a lot of ideas. And it turned out pretty nice. The Corten looks really, really rich and warm against the cold brick. Here we are sort of admiring it. But the stuff of architecture in China, this gray brick, is so common. It's everywhere. And we said, what can we do with the gray brick? And so we said, what if we use the brick as a way to sort of acknowledge where you are? And so we had this idea, we put a compass on the brick, and the brick is always cardinal. And so this concept of, so here's the plan, and then there's orthogonal and there's obliques. And every time we turn the corner, like that's an orthogonal and that's an oblique. So the bricks are always cardinal. And what that means is that as you walk around the building, you're going from smooth to jagged to smooth and jagged. And it's really sort of starting to sort of tell you something about what the geometry of the building's doing. And so as you walk around the building, it's sort of locating you in the site and around the building. And so this is a kind of east-west wall and an oblique wall. And the texture of the architecture is sort of signaling that. It's also sort of telling you these two are not orthogonal. And it's producing a kind of background against which these sort of bright figures are sort of embedded. But it's also creating a kind of texture that signals something else. And to the client, it communicated Chineseness, something that we could not have sort of understood sort of before we started. And so for us, this was an incredible learning experience. We went in with our kind of abstraction and our kind of Western mode of thinking and abstracting and sort of making contemporary. And then by getting sent back to the drawing board and forced to sort of recover, we came up with something that I think was actually quite different. It's not something we could have imagined from the start. But I think it does speak to a kind of practice that is at once global and local, and trying to work to fit in. I think if we went just global, we would sort of propose something that would, work here in the States or might work, elsewhere. But by thinking about what's available in China in terms of labor, how can we communicate this simple rule to a bricklayer in Chengdu who can place the brick always in the same orientation and achieve a kind of, I think, quite dramatic effect by making sure that the rules are simple, the rules are communicable. And at the end of the day, the effect is perceptible, and I think people who walk by the building say, oh, yeah, that looks like it fits in, that looks like it's somehow got that Chinese feeling. So that was a kind of big lesson for us. Another project in a different mode, now I'm talking about Curtis's different modes, if that was maybe globalization and sort of context, this is starting to shift towards something else. A few years ago in Boston, there was a bombing at the marathon, and several people were killed. In the aftermath, the terrorists sort of killed an MIT police officer, Sean Collier, on campus. And so Sean Collier was sort of instantly sort of memorialized through these sort of spontaneous displays. And MIT, who had never experienced this before, said, how do we acknowledge this? How do we commemorate this? And so they asked Meijin to think about making a memorial. And they said, how can we make a memorial that is contemporary? How do we make a memorial that's MIT? And so we thought about, well, what's a memorial? What's a memorial today? And there were lots of ideas. And, at the school, they had 180 sort of proposals for what to do for this memorial. And some people wanted a flag, and some people wanted a forest. But as we thought about what is a memorial today, we realized that, it could be as ephemeral as as a flash on an LED screen. I saw this the other day on the mascot highway sign, But as we thought about what's appropriate, we were thinking about MIT, And their slogan is Mens et Manus, which is hand in mind, which is somehow appropriate for MIT. They added Fortis, which is strength, and their t-shirts that said MIT strong, Boston strong, Collier strong. This was a kind of response to terrorism. We need to be strong. And so when we started thinking about it, we said, well, what is strength for architecture, and how do we think about strength and structure and maybe equilibrium as a concept? That's where Sean Collier was killed, right there next to this Frank Gehry building. That's where his cruiser was parked. And so we thought about this hand, this sort of MIT hand, the open hand, and this desire for a flag or a star or a forest or a boulder. And we said, how do we reconcile all those things? And so we came up with this idea of we'll make a figure that kind of marks the spot kind of figure. We'll take a boulder that they wanted, we'd take away the boulder, and then we'd get the void or the trace or the conspicuous absence of that boulder. And so the memorial was really a kind of an abstract figure that became this sort of hollowing that does resemble a hand or a star. It does have a missing boulder. And so in a way it sort of responds to all these desires for the same thing. Like the family wanted a forest and a water feature, and the police officers wanted a star or a flag. And so we produced something that's sort of flickering sort of between different readings. For some it's a hand, for some it's a star. For some it's an arch, it's a vault, and for some it's an operation, it's a Boolean, it's a subtraction, it's the intersection of two geometries. And it also acts as a kind of viewing device. You can sort of use it to sort of sight from the center the location of where his cruiser was parked. But basically this sort of figure, this abstract figure, tries to negotiate all these different desires that are sort of being mapped on it. We also thought it would be great if we could make it out of solid stone. And that's something that we presented to MIT leadership, and we said, we'd like it to be solid. Because the contractor said, how about veneer? And we said, what's veneer? So we said, what if we make it an arch, and we use an archaic building technology like an arch, and we actually build it out of solid blocks. And so we embarked on this with the advice of many experts, like John Oxendorf, who's a structural engineer at MIT, whose specialization is, in a way, Inca and Guastavino vaults and Inca stone setting. And so we sat down with John, who's over here, and Hauke, who's from Rivers Helbig, and Sam from Suffolk, and we tried to figure out how to make an arch today. It's a building technology that's so obsolete nobody remembers how to do it. We know it conceptually. There's false work, there's scaffolding, you sort of work your way through the middle, you drop in a keystone. But this design frustrated all the structural engineers' software, because all the structural engineers were trying to use tension and compression, and we said there's only compression. There's no tension in this system, it's only compression. And what would it take to do just stone? Stone is falling. As it falls, it jams, it thrusts onto other stones, that thrusts onto other stones, that thrusts onto other stones. So we did this with the help of 4 different structural engineers. We basically realized that it's super sensitive to lateral displacement, right? And so if those buttresses start to move, it'll displace by a factor of 6. So 1 millimeter this way is 6 millimeters that way. And collapse could happen pretty quickly if those buttresses start to slide. And so we realized that it required a kind of precision. You know, the tolerance of this would not allow for any sort of slippage. And so it had to fit together perfectly. Arches tend to do that. They tend to fit perfectly. We did work it out with our model, with a high degree of precision. We modeled it. We were so proud of all the geometries. We calculated it, and then we sort of procured it. So we went to Virginia, we found the blocks, and we sort of verified that within this massive piece of stone we could extract out the figure, this perfect figure that had to be fabricated with no error. We couldn't be more than a millimeter off, because if it was off by a millimeter, then it wouldn't fit. And if it didn't fit, we'd have concentrated loads, which could produce cracking, which could produce collapse. So there was this kind of extra need to be precise. We talked about levels of precision, and we had a huge confidence in our digital fabrication. We have the tools, we have the technology. Why not demand this kind of precision So we worked with a fabricator in Wisconsin, Okwara Stone, and they milled and they milled and they milled. Some of these blocks were milled for weeks at a time, 24 hours a day, continuously cutting, carving. And what we learned is that you put the file in the contractor's hands, the contractor develops a tool path, the tool is cutting the stone, you think you know what the diameter of the saw is, but as the saw cuts the stone wears, and the saw wears. So the diameter of the saw is getting smaller every time it cuts the stone. And so you think, oh, it's a computer, I can tell it exactly how it will be in the world, but the fact is the saw is diminishing in size too. So do you know really where the interface between the stone and the saw is? You don't really know, because every time the tool crosses the stone, the tool changes. And so that's a kind of reminder, that a material like stone is pushing back. Even as your digital tools are carving it, there's a kind of resistance that the material produces. And that resistance we think about as error. In architecture, we demand a kind of precision and a tolerance because we have digital tools, but this resistance that the stone was providing was such a kind of an eye-opening recognition of the kind of stubbornness of material, even as we think we can carve it with all of our digital tools. So at the end of the day, we learned a lot about stone fabrication, about finishing and polishing, but also about QA/QC. How do you do quality control on a block of stone where there are no shop drawings? You've just handed them a digital file, and they're telling you, before I put it on the truck, trust me, it's exactly the way you specified it. So we actually had to develop a different methodology for verifying the precision of the block before it got on the truck and was shipped to Boston from Wisconsin. So all kinds of interesting adventures in digital fabrication. At the end of the day, we did fabricate all the blocks. They were delivered on time. They arrived on site and they were laid over this grade beam, which is set on many piles. Halfway through, we discovered there's a duct bank going through the site, which is all the power and data to MIT. So not something you want to mess with. So luckily, we were spanning over that duct bank. We managed to install all the pieces. They arrived on site. They were beautiful pieces of granite. We picked the granite with a kind of figure so that you could follow the figure around the stone. It wasn't a piece of veneer that would change as it wrapped the corner. You would see the grain moving around. Those holes there, this is the debate between John Oxendorf and Nippers Helbig. So John Oxendorf said, I don't need pins. The pins will be gone in 300 years. The stone will be there for 1,000. Nippers Helbig said, I'm the engineer of record. I want a pin. And so guess who won? We got pins. So they're stainless steel pins that just align the stones. They're not doing any work. They're not seeing any load. Unless the stone slips, then they'll retain the alignment and ensure that the loads are transferred. So you think you have an engineer, you think there's a single solution. There's a million solutions. Every engineer will have a different approach to how to do this particular problem. We installed this in the snowiest winter in recorded history. We had more than 100 inches of snow. It went up. It had to be done by April 15th, which was the anniversary of the attack. All the scaffolding is there. I should say we started with the corners. We started with the keystone, right? You always imagine the keystone goes in last, right? In this case, we started the keystone. We built a memorial around it because we figured this piece has 5 sides and 3 faces, so there's 15 faces that have to be perfect. And you're more likely to get that done first and then shed the tolerance towards the perimeter than you are to get all these pieces in and then try to drop a piece in the last minute. So we learned something about starting in the middle and working our way out. And then the buttresses came in and supported it. Because it's MIT, they said this is research, and so they put all these scales underneath, and they were measuring the load, the vertical load that was carrying each of the blocks. And so, the thing about force is that you can't see it, right? You can't see force in a material, but you can measure it. And so all these scales were measuring the weight of the blocks as they were sitting on the scaffolding. And as they lowered the scaffold, they could watch the load transfer from the center to the perimeter. And so they saw arching take place through the scales. So John was very excited. All these guys were super excited to hollow out the scaffolding. And after months and months and months of working in this sort of scaffolding, they saw the kind of hollow for the first time. And it took 8 hours to lower all the scaffolding. And everybody was sort of sitting there waiting, and then nothing happened. You know, it stayed there. It stayed up in the air, and everybody said it was the most exciting day of their lives. We thought it was pretty exciting too. So the memorial was completed. It was inaugurated. If you go there today, you'll see this sort of hollow. It actually has weird effects when you walk under it. The acoustics change. You get these sort of focal points. There's a polished surface on the inside and a kind of flame surface on the outside. It does produce a lot of a kind of sense of enclosure, semi-enclosure. We're trying to screen a little bit of the Frank Gehry building in the background. It's hard to think about being contemplative when there's this sort of agitated architecture around it. But it does do that. It does sort of produce a kind of semi-enclosure. It does produce, I think, a sense of kind of awe or wonder at about how this arch, which has about a 70-foot span, could be so horizontal. And we did introduce these lights that are kind of constellation of the stars on the night that he was killed. So there's layers and layers of meaning that are built into a memorial that not everyone will perceive, but they might perceive it or they might not. They might find new meanings in it. But it was inaugurated. This is the inauguration. There is some text there to acknowledge Sean Collier. And it has become part of the fabric of the campus. And then about 6 months ago, we got an email message saying, hey, something's happened. A drunk driver lost control, ran into the memorial. And we're like, oh my God, did it collapse? You know, did it, you know? Apparently it did not collapse. It stood still, they cleaned it up, but I'm glad the pins are in there. Just because I think belts and braces, you know, we don't need them, but it's good to know that they're in there. So more lessons learned, I think, from working in a mode that's unfamiliar. Like, we're not structural engineers, we're not stone aficionados, but we sort of undertook this project on the hunch that a contemporary arch would be an appropriate response for MIT to take in the face of a kind of terrorist attack. It would provide a new type of memorial that isn't representational explicitly, but communicates so much content on so many different levels through different kinds of abstraction. And MIT's pleased because it's something that it's new, it's also research, it's also didactic. You can sort of look at it and start to read it. You can read the kind of question of thrust and the sort of the inclination of the joints actually perpendicular to the thrust line. And so there is a kind of didactic quality to the memorial. The family and the community seems quite pleased with it. We continue to do projects in the public realm, partially because as a young practice, those are the kinds of projects you can get. Private projects, public projects. We did this project in Phoenix a few years ago. It was an art project. And we said, well, maybe we could make a shelter. We can make place by making shade. And shade, not just shade, but actually shadow. And so how do we sort of make something that casts shadows? And in Phoenix, which is incredibly hot, the idea of a public parasol might be a way to create place, make people gather in the shade. And so we developed this sort of origami type of canopy. We also observed that, this is Mexico City, that people will stand under the shadow of the flag. And you know, over the course of the day that moves around and the people just sort of scoot around with it. So we thought, that's good. In Phoenix, maybe people will move with the shadow of this canopy. And so we proposed this canopy. It's on Roosevelt Street. And we developed a unit and we aggregated it, again with Nippers Hellbig, to develop something that was very, very thin. It's a steel plate, it's 1/4 inch. And we fabricated it in Phoenix. From certain views, it's completely transparent. Other views, it's completely opaque. And so it blocks the sun. It lets the air move through it. It also creates patterns of shadow on the ground. And so when you observe people sitting underneath it, they'll sit under the shadow and they won't sit in the sun. And so another kind of lesson in placemaking, in material research, and in human behavior. How do people use it in the daytime, at nighttime? It's actually better used at nighttime, if you can imagine. It also has PVs, which are sort of oriented towards the sun, and they sort of illuminate the structure at nighttime. Curtis alluded to this polypropylene swings. We keep getting asked to do these public art projects, and the problem is once you do one, then they ask you to do more, and so as a young architect, you're like, well, I really want to stop this stuff, but they keep asking for it. So we did this proposal about 4 years ago for these swings at the Massachusetts Convention Center. They said, can we activate this park? It's a temporary park, and we need to make it really active. And we said, well, how about a kind of playful space? And so we made the swings that have an accelerometer in them. So when they tip, they turn pink, and when they're still, they're white. And so the swings sort of respond to the kind of degree of inclination. So it's a simple piece of electronics. As if people need incentives to swing, it changes color to incentivize you to make it pink. But the first year it opened, it was immensely popular, not just for kids, but also for grown-ups. And we found that architecture, quote unquote, like this can provoke different kinds of behaviors, even amongst grown-ups and serious people who wouldn't necessarily want to be seen swinging. Will sort of let down their hair, and they'll start to behave in ways that you didn't expect. Another kind of lesson in building and behavior is how people behave in these types of environments. And the first year we made it at a Polypro with a CNC mill. We did this in our studio. We have a kind of maker tendency, and so here they are. The cross section is a triangle, like the St. Louis Arch. It's super rigid. And people don't expect it to be rigid because it's lit. Right? Something that's lit shouldn't be rigid, but it is. And then we developed rotational molding. So you sort of put this thing in, it goes in an oven, and it sort of coats the mold. And so we get these beautiful pieces that come out. And there's the kind of accelerometer. But we installed one, and then we installed a field of them. We also did PVs. But the crazy thing is, if you build it, they come, and people just, you can't get a swing these days because they're so crowded. And so this public space is so successful, partially because there's a beer garden next to it, but it's super successful. People love the swings. They do things you didn't expect on them. We made some signs like "please do" and then "please don't." And we wanted to have more do's than don'ts. But I've been collecting these because people do crazy things for a camera, and we post them on Instagram. So I'm always sort of watching to see how they use them. Even the Blue Man Group was there, and Delta Airlines was advertising to the world, come to Boston, swing on our swing. So, so we made these icons like do this and then do this, and that's okay. You can push, you can do this, but don't do that. And then we thought what are the limits of what you can do and what you can't do? So no smoking, please. No rough play. Don't drink too much. Enjoy responsibly. Don't leave luggage unattended. Look after your pets. Don't steal them, please. And then we got carried away with these, and we said, take selfies, please. Post on social media, have fun. There was a show at Cooper Union called Drawing Codes, and they were asking us to think about codes, right? And people were sort of computationally doing drawings. But we thought, these are kind of codes, right? Codified behavior. Urban farming is good. This is bad. This is bad. This is bad. Anyways, we got carried away. So, don't be an asshole. Don't use the swing. Okay, so that was kind of fun. In our book, because this is a format for a book, right? In our book, we have different chapters. One of the chapters we called Ecologics. And so we said, what is it about the present moment that we're all of a sudden aware of our environment? And we became aware of our environment maybe when we looked at New York Magazine and saw Manhattan was black for half of it, right? This is Superstorm Sandy, which wiped out the power grid for lower Manhattan. And at that point, people realized that our cities, which we thought were, fantastic, are actually super vulnerable to the most gentle of superstorms, right? And then Houston, and then Puerto Rico, and so we cannot deny that the environment is changing, that the human sort of actions are affecting that environment. And what are we to do? Can we do better planning? Can we do better zoning? Can we do more pervious sidewalks, pervious plazas? Can we have land use that doesn't celebrate the automobile? There's so many questions, and what is design to do? So we think, well, what do we need to do? We need to convince people to behave differently. It's not about PVs, it's actually about behavior. And how do we convince people that their behavior matters? And how do we convince people that energy is visible? And so we've made some sort of modest attempts to sort of make energy legible. And a few years ago, we sort of continued the tradition of do-it-yourself kind of maker projects. We thought we could make a better wind turbine, and we thought maybe people don't like wind turbines because they think they're machines, they think they're ugly. What if they were beautiful, like this piece of sculpture? So we thought we could invent a better wind turbine. And we tried different designs. I thought that one was quite attractive, but it didn't spin quite so well. And I thought it doesn't need to be optimal, it just needs to be barely functional. Right? So if it just spun enough to light up, that would be enough. At the end of the day, we went with this one. But we installed this at MIT. There's a building called the Green Building, which is designed by AIA. It's a skyscraper, and the wind hits it, and it rolls down. And so when it opened, you couldn't open the doors because there was too much negative pressure on the doors. So this was a huge embarrassment to MIT. And so we said, what if we take that Green Building at MIT and we install 400 wind turbines on it, because the wind is rushing through there anyways. And could we make the wind visible? Could we make energy legible? Could we produce a kind of eco-literacy among people so that they recognize that these energy sources are abundant, they're around us, and maybe we can convince them to sort of recognize their kind of environmental presence on this planet. So this is a kind of series of how can we make a contribution to environmental thinking, not by saving or using less, but maybe by making more. We also, a few years ago, we proposed this project in Philadelphia. Philadelphia Mural Arts was our client. They're an arts organization. And we pitched this idea of an outdoor environmental learning classroom in the Schuylkill River. And so if you know Philadelphia, it's a city between two rivers, and those rivers have historically led to the kind of growth of Philadelphia. But if you follow that river, this is the Schuylkill River, Delaware, Schuylkill, there's Philly. If you follow the Schuylkill, it goes right up into coal country. And so for hundreds of years, coal has come down the Schuylkill. It's been processed and shipped out of Philadelphia. So Philadelphia, we know the kind of historic city, but we don't really know this kind of energy metropolis. And so the Schuylkill was so polluted, it caught on fire at some point. It was so polluted with chemicals, with fuel that was spilling into the river. So the Schuylkill, turns out it was one of the first Superfund sites. The federal government said, we're going to clean this up. And it turns out that there's a tremendous desire to sort of reconnect to the waterfront. Philadelphia sort of turns back on the waterfront. How can we make that connection again? And so the proposal is to float this classroom out onto the Schuylkill. And you see the energy infrastructure is right there. Can we bring people right up to the water, right into the water, and sort of reframe their relationship to the water? So they're not looking down on it, they're sort of looking at it. And they're sort of perceiving the river in a different way. Could we produce a kind of moment where they would perceive the question of urban nature differently? Could we reframe their attitude about the river through a kind of displacement of the sort of point of view? So this was a proposal. We said, let's make a submarine that we could float out into the river. We fill it with water, so we sink it into the river. Submarines flood their ballast chambers to sort of submerge, and then they pump out the water to surface. So we built a mock-up in Philadelphia. We dropped it in the river. It's yellow, of course. So we launched a prototype to prove that we could submerge a chamber into the river. We brought our donors to the site. They experienced the float lab in this way, and they gave us $3 million to build the submarine. So look out for a float lab, not this summer, but next summer, because we're going to float it out into the river to allow people to experience that urban nature from a different vantage point. The last chapter in the book, books are tricky because they take a long time to make, and you put it in there, by the time it comes out, it's all old work. And so what's the point of making a book? And we thought to do a book, we'd have to have some content that's sort of as timely as possible, but also content that you couldn't find online. And so feeds are so powerful, but we wanted to have some kind of work in progress. So this is a bit of a snapshot of the studio, like what's going on and how do we make stuff. But I thought there could be some sort of current work in the book. And so I want to show you two more projects that are super current, and we'll see if they make it in the book, because I'm not so sure. But we keep doing work in China. This is Chengdu. This is typical urbanism in China. It's kind of this fantasy landscape of lakes and villas. It looks a bit like this. If you follow that road, you hit the center of Chengdu. This is a building by Antoine Friedach. There's a building by Jean Nouvel that's under construction just beyond it. So our client controls this piece of real estate, this big. That's the size of Lower Manhattan. And they're building like crazy. So they approached us and said, how would you like to do site F? And we said, well, Michael Malton's doing A, and Brooke Scarpa's doing E. So I called them up and I said, are they paying you? And they said, yes, they're paying us. Okay. So we decided to go for it, and we're working on this project. This hotel, that's Michael's hotel. That's Larry's hotel. We're doing this hotel. And we said, well, what's a boutique hotel with 18 rooms? Maybe we can think about it as a kind of sculpture, as a kind of figure. So we pitched this idea of this kind of subtracted solid, which will be the hotel. The rooms are actually in this zone here. And we're developing this with the client for 18 rooms. And how do you achieve those big sort of sculpted voids? You have a big megatruss. You support the building above in a conventional way, and then you hang the stuff below. We build these models because in China, when you come with a model like that, you can always tell the engineer, like, that member right there, can I get rid of that one? And it's a lot better when you have a physical model, because if you don't speak Chinese, it's hard to point to a digital model. So you bring a physical model with you, you can coordinate much better. So this is a hotel. We're in design development. We're working out the inevitable need for windows in a hotel, which is sort of working against our desire to create a kind of solid into which we can carve away these voids. But we are excited to develop this facade as this sort of a kind of Boolean extrusion to sort of create that aperture in there. So we want to hold the surface, keep it solid, but still allow for views through it. And so this is a kind of ongoing project in China with these kind of crazy schedules. Hopefully they won't change our program or the site or mirror our plans without it. Okay, so this is sort of ongoing. It's sort of in the works. I'll just skip through it quickly. And then, okay, so the last project I want to show tonight is this project for UVA. UVA is, the academical village designed by Thomas Jefferson. It sort of set the kind of template for all American sort of campus design, I would say. And it produced this ideal view. The ideal view of the pavilions, the lawn, the rotunda. It's perfect, but the only thing that's not perfect is how is this enabled? And if you look here, you see that there is a slave taking care of a white baby. And so what we know is that University of Virginia was built by slaves, professors owned slaves, students owned slaves. And so Jefferson's sort of idealism sort of runs aground on this question of how did it actually work? It actually relied on the kind of violence and institutionalized slavery. So UVA recognizes this, and they launched a campaign to build a memorial to acknowledge that. In fact, when we were preparing for our interview with UVA, I remember vividly Michelle Obama at the Democratic National Convention said, I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. And I think that was a moment where a lot of people said, holy shit, that's true. The history of this country and all these monuments and institutions were built on the backs of enslaved peoples. I think that was quite eye-opening. At the same time, these Confederate monuments are being contested. This is Robert E. Lee Square in Charlottesville, Virginia. So you've got slave history, you've got founding father who owned slaves, all these contradictions. You have people for whom this statue represents their cultural identity, but for others this represents intimidation, violence, racism. And so as we prepared to interview for this project, we thought, how can we engage in this dialogue? How can we add something to it? How can architecture help? How does it participate in this? So we put together a great team. We went for the interview. We got the project. Then we went through this 6-month engagement process, meeting with the churches, meeting with the students, meeting with the staff. We proposed many different schemes all around the university. We finally settled on one site, which is here. It's a circle. It's the same diameter as the rotunda. So as the rotunda is a kind of cupola, this is a kind of bowl, a kind of negative figure. What we understood is that making a place for people to gather, a kind of clearing in the woods, a kind of opening between the campus and the city might be something that could be used. There would be inscriptions and carvings on the outside and names carved on the inside. So this is the proposal. It's kind of an earthwork, partially because it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so you can't really build anything but an earthwork. You couldn't build a new structure there because you wouldn't be allowed to. So someone pointed out that Jefferson's real contribution wasn't so much architectural as landscape, as site planning. You know, the brilliance of UVA is its terracing and the way it sort of, the pavilions face the lawn, but on the underside they sort of face these sort of sunken gardens where all the slaves were working and slaughtering animals and chopping firewood, and nobody saw it because all that stuff was hidden by the section, and the section was produced by the landscape. And so maybe this idea of a site work is actually not a bad idea. Turns out there were up to 5,000 slaves working on campus at different times. Very few of them were actually named or recorded because they were property. And so the records are very sparse, but we wanted to acknowledge them somehow by inscribing something onto this memorial. And so we've been working with an artist who's sort of looking at the kind of textures and the carvings and looking at how we could inscribe on the outside, because there's a tremendous desire for something visual, something recognizable. Abstraction, we understood, isn't going to cut it. And so we're developing a technique called photovicar, where we can use a mill to sort of cut grooves in at different depths to produce a kind of graphic image that is sort of masked by this vertical pattern. And so we can take a raster image, like the eyes from Isabella Gibbons, who's one of the first slaves to actually come out of slavery, and she became a teacher. And so a photograph of Isabella Gibbons is being sort of carved and etched into this memorial through this technique. And it's interesting because there's points of view where you see the image and then the points of view where you don't. And so we're sort of working at this sort of delicate balance between, maybe it's between signal and noise, but there's so much sort of texture and noise, and at a certain moment it sort of comes into focus and you sort of perceive the image, and then it's gone. So that's something hard to do. It's hard to do in stone, but this is a mock-up that we're doing in Wisconsin. And if you stand back far enough, you can almost see an eyeball in there. Can you see it? So there's the pupil. anyways, it's something that's going to be quite big. It's going to be on a curve, and so you're going to walk around it and sort of discover this image and then sort of keep walking. It's a pretty tricky sort of fabrication thing. We're developing the patterns. We're sort of figuring out what the right angles are, and in a way, like the slope of the wall is sort of inscribing the kind of, the geometry of your body. When you're standing, you can just sort of touch the wall. So it has that. And the question of names is super difficult because they were considered property. They weren't always given names, and so how do you acknowledge the humanity of an enslaved person when it's hard to say what their names were? And so we've got historians at UVA sort of looking through the records, assembling the names, and then we're trying to memorialize 5,000 names, but we don't have 5,000 names. So we're making 5,000 marks, and as names are discovered, apparently there's new names found every year. Those could be inscribed. We call them like the underscores, and then the names would be added above the underscore. So this is a kind of detailed development, but we're sort of working on this sort of pattern. And there's a sense of like, when you experience 5,000 of anything, a kind of quantity has a certain quality, and to be sort of enveloped in 5,000 marks, you can have a kind of visceral sense of like, wow, this is a lot of people that were working here anonymously within this super violent institutionalized system. So this is ongoing. The memorial renderings were produced. I've got a little video to show you. It's something that we produced, for the fundraising efforts. What you saw there was a timeline that's being carved into the memorial, and you think a timeline is something fairly straightforward. There's a group of historians at UVA that have assembled a timeline. They've been arguing about the actual wording for months. They're saying, can we say the word rape or should we say sexual assault? And is saying sexual assault different from rape? The timeline records some real atrocities. 3 UVA students raped a 13-year-old slave. That's going to get carved into the memorial. And the UVA Board of Visitors said, is that something that we want carved in our memorial? Should we have that on our campus? Is that something appropriate? And so we said, we have to present these facts in a way objectively. This memorial is meant to acknowledge these atrocities in a very direct way. If we start to sugarcoat it or edit it or whitewash it, that's the slippery slope, right? You start to say, well, I don't want to advertise these acts of violence on our campus. But it's meant to acknowledge those acts of violence. So we're right in the middle of a debate between the Board of Visitors who's saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't have these gruesome acts carved in stone right on our campus. And the historians saying, this is the front line of history. If we give now, we will have sort of participated in this sort of great sort of whitewashing of these events. So fascinating to see sort of history sort of working itself out as we start to carve blocks of stone that are being placed on the campus. A couple more thoughts. So as this project was announced, it was written up in the Washington Post. And then 2 weeks later, the last summer actually, these guys showed up, right? And why did these neo-Nazi, KKK, right-wing people show up on UVA's campus? They showed up because the statue of Robert E. Lee was there, and there was a desire to remove that statue. And so their argument was, we're here to defend this statue. They're here to defend their identity. but why did they pick UVA, and why are they standing in front of the rotunda, right? Why not stand in front of the Robert E. Lee statue, which is on the other side of town? But they came to UVA to stand in front of Jefferson's iconic architecture because maybe they felt that the ambiguity of Jefferson's kind of, I like slaves, I don't like slaves, that ambiguity, I think, opens the door to this kind of, well, maybe we can leverage Jefferson. Maybe Jefferson would support our cause. Maybe Trump would support our cause. So the fact that these guys showed up on UVA's campus, because there's a kind of unresolved question with history, I think speaks to the need to address those histories quite directly. So this was a kind of frightening moment when these guys showed up. I think, immediately afterwards there was a kind of counter demonstration by students and people in the community. But it does, I think, call or necessitate a kind of direct response, a kind of response that is official and firm and unequivocal, calling out the history of the university, somehow acknowledging it in a permanent way. And I do think architecture can play that role. We talk about memorials and monuments today, they seem outmoded, but there is a role for that. I think there is a role for architecture to communicate those values quite emphatically and quite unequivocally. And so I do think if we are to build a monument or a memorial to acknowledge that violent history, somehow that ambiguity would be less ambiguous, and somehow those assholes that showed up last summer wouldn't feel like they could leverage Jefferson for their cause. And I think that says to me that these types of architectures are urgently needed. And I guess that's a bit of the kind of signal and noise, that these are messages, these are broadcasts, that are, they're political, they're urgent, they're necessary. And I think architecture and design does matter in this particular moment in time. Thank you very much.
Can you talk a little bit about the way that you guys resolve details? I'm really curious, particularly in the China project, how those wall sections have been resolved, because it seems like the project was all sort of beyond your control, and then you had to reapproach it in a way after it was already established. So how do you approach a project at the micro scale when things are happening, sort of at the mega scale, and resolve watershed issues and things like that?
Yeah. The question is about resolving details in a context where you're not completely in control, right? Working globally. In China, we work to a certain point, we draw as much as we can, and inevitably we hand it over, and an LDI takes it, and then they build it however they think is appropriate. And so we had these fantasies about, Chinese sort of timber framing and how those things come together, and we thought, to get that real Chinese feeling, we need some authentic, construction details. All that structure is concrete, and so all of our ideas about joining, and there was a kind of romantic idea that they would execute something like that. They're super pragmatic, and so they build a concrete frame, and then they sort of build a cavity wall, and the veneer, brick is a veneer. They're real bricks, but there's a cavity wall there, and tiebacks, as we would do here. We drew it as detailed as we could. We controlled it as long as we could. We offered to come out and coordinate with them, and they always said no. So we just booked tickets, and we showed up in Chengdu and said, "We're here, let's coordinate." And we managed to get a lot of coordination done. When you show up, they'll get all the engineers in a room, and then you'll argue with them and work it out. And first they say, "Impossible," and then you sort of draw it through, and they say, "Okay, we'll build it for your design." So I think to build in China, you really need to go there. You need to be there as often as you can. If you have an idea you want to execute, you sort of have to put that effort in, because they're so based on the kind of quickest, most expedient path that if you're not there to steer it, it'll just happen without you. But I think we are interested in how things come together, and so we try to specify it. We also try to think, like, what can they execute? If every brick was rotated differently, like a Komatsu and Kohler kind of thing, if it requires a robot to place it, forget it. And so Komatsu and Kohler's architecture relies on the robot for that kind of precision. In this context, we said, let's make them all the same. And so the rule is uniform across the whole facade, and so they can't really screw it up. It's an instruction, it's a code, and it's like super simple. And it takes into account the labor context in which you're working. So if you're in Switzerland, you can do the robots. If you're in Chengdu, you got to rely on humans. human error. So we try to calibrate design to the context in which we're working, something that's achievable, impactful, appropriate.
In a project like this, where there's a lot of cultural context, a lot of like history and personal experience to navigate, is there a process that you use for sort of entrenching yourself and being open to the experience that you're trying to depict in your design, or navigate all that goes along with it?
This was super difficult, right? Nobody knows how to acknowledge slavery. And when we interviewed for the project, they said, we don't want any designs for 6 months. Spend 6 months working with the community, and then we'll talk about design. And architects are like, oh, I've got some designs in my pocket, I always wanted to do this, And we spent 6 months meeting with the churches and the staff and the faculty and the students and the descendants. There's a huge town and gown problem in Charlottesville, and they refer to the university as the plantation. So there's all kinds of tensions that are there. The importance of going to all of those community meetings and then working with them. We produced a ton of design work, and we showed it to them. The design is a circle. When I was in school, my professor said, when architects don't know what to do, they draw a circle. And I think there's something to that. It's something that it's acceptable. And would I have liked it to be different? Maybe. But this is a negotiation with all kinds of questions of meaning and history and painful history. So the idea of a kind of rotated figure that sort of emerges from the ground and sort of carved in the ground, I think there's a kind of an ability to find a kind of consensus meaning within that form. And that came out of a 5-month design phase that followed the 6-month listening and working phase. I think as any designer would, you sort of try lots of different things, and certain things resonate with different people. It's not an intellectual thing that, someone said, oh, it's like a shackle, It's like, well, maybe it's a shackle, maybe it's a moon, maybe it's a bowl. But there's, when you do these things, you have to sort of think about what could you read in it, and then what can't you anticipate. Someone's going to misread in it. And that's the kind of slipperiness of meaning. But working explicitly in a meaning heavy architecture, like a Mural, I think you have to develop sort of modes of abstraction and modes of the kind of openness to allow different meanings to be projected onto it. But it was not an easy process by any means. And it was vetted and vetted and vetted and continues to be vetted, even down to the word choice and the punctuation of the timeline that's going to acknowledge these violent acts. So someone said, oh, be careful, we're going to be the memorial architects, right? We're not memorial architects, but we do enjoy projects that make us work intellectually as architects. And so it's, we can develop a project or a house or a memorial, but some of them challenge you intellectually more than others. And the quality memorial, the UVA memorial, have been incredibly difficult and thought-provoking. And it tests your abilities as an architect, tests your abilities in a kind of public presentation. To go to a church and present a design to a group of descendants of slaves, that's a tough audience. So I think you learn how to be an architect by being an architect. So we don't have an answer, but we're trying to figure it out.
There's a delicate approach to form making in a lot of these projects, but if we're speaking about interfaces and the interface that is used to make these kind of projects also seems to influence that form making. You mentioned Boolean a lot, and I can't help describe some of these circles as sweet or something. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the influence of those kind of interfaces on the making of architecture.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I do think the tool, affects what's drawn on the tool, whether it's pencil or, Rhino or Revit or any software interface. We used to talk about this is a form, and the form is something recognizable as a form. Now we talk about operations, loft this to that, or building this from that. I do think our workflow, like all of our workflow, has become a series of operations that are somewhat determined by software. And so you can imagine certain things, you can code certain things, you can script certain things, but there are certain techniques and methods that we need, and those, to some extent, function of the tools that we're using. And so we're very aware of a number of sort of building operations that we've been using for the memorial, for the town, even for the other memorial. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we can acknowledge that. Are we resistant to that? I think we're aware of that. I think probably all of us who use the same softwares are sort of drawn to certain operations, and I think that's just a part of the way we work in this particular moment. My point about the carving and the wearing and the tolerance, I think, is that the smoothness with which digital tools appear to promise these sort of hyper-precise realities isn't quite there. And so it's good to go to the level of awareness that the digital tool is going to promise you a perfect material output, effortlessly.
This is a real question, like a real question I'm really curious about. It's not like set up. And in that regard, it was a beautiful lecture. I'm really impressed. I really appreciate it. The rotated circle, it's a swing, it's a classroom, and it's a memorial. In none of those places is the detail of its three-dimensionality and architectural performance. Each time it performs slightly differently. And so it appears more and more and more like the Hudsucker project. It's not just a circle, it's a circle with a signature. And that signature is not particularly performative. And by the time you get to the memorial and somebody says, oh look, it's a swing set, oh look, it's a classroom, and now it's this memorial, I start to wonder for myself, when does it get, does someone say to you, because of social media or something like that, is this your signature? What is the, not even the justification, what is the architectural status of that form? No claims to specificity, no claims to its performance. A circle would have been fine. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, it's troubling.
I didn't mean to trouble you, right? I said it was the real question.
People have raised that before.
Good.
These were all projects that were sort of happening around the same time. Sometimes you try it, it fails, you try again, it fails. I think the swing, that was probably the first one. That is a kind of
Swinging classroom would have been okay. It's when you get to the memorial, I worry about that. I really do worry about somebody. Newspaper says, "Hey, it was this," like, "Oh my God, they used it as a swing." And now here it is.
Yeah, that's probably. They all sort of emerged through their own process, right? The swing was its own process, and the classroom was its own process. And this is its third time, And I do think there's a kind of.
But that hadn't happened. No one's raised it like that.
No one's raised it like that. There were some concerns about. I'll tell you a story. So we're down in North Carolina, interviewing a stone fabricator, and very large stone fabricator. I was in the coffee room, and I noticed they had something on the bulletin board that said, "I wish I was an illegal alien. Had good benefits," or something like that. And then someone's like, "Oh, this guy's built the Richmond. There's the avenue with all those Confederate generals, and the same guys built all those monuments, same fabricators." And so I said, "That could be a problem. You use the same fabricator to build the Confederate monuments to build the slave memorial. That's the problem." And so I asked questions to the fabricator, like, "Hey, what is it with these Stonewall Jackson memorials?" "Well, we build them. We're agnostic. We build it for the Confederates, or was it for you? We don't really care. I said, well, that could be a problem with perception. But there's a kind of seriousness, and a kind of moral position of the memorial for the slaves that is undermined by you were having built this monument for the Confederate general. And they said, well, I don't think that's a problem. That's kind of balance, isn't it? Balance. It's not balance. That's the problem. So I raised it with this fabricator, and I said, you know what, just maybe take it off the website. I think it's inappropriate to have the Stonewall Jackson and the slaves on the same website, same property. They took it off the website. But this question of, they thought that there was a kind of moral equivalence between the Confederate general monuments and the slave memorial. And
Is it that meant they were agnostic?
no, I think they were misinformed.
Oh, you mean as if they were equivalent?
Yes, they thought that was fair and balanced. I thought that was inappropriate. I raised it with our client. I said, I'm not sure I can recommend this fabricator, honestly. They seem to be capable technically, but I don't think they're politically in the right mindset. So I think certain projects require a certain kind of attitude, and the question of the circle and the kind of the fusing of the circle or the kind of diluting of the circle. I mean, we can't claim the circle. I mean, the circle is a circle. But
It's the loft.
the loft is another problem.
Can I ask you about your video and this fantastic problem you're having? It's not an architectural problem, but very much related to the use of description in architecture, and that's these quote, like rape or sexual assault. Your video shows the words as in water, so that sometimes you can't read it because of the movement of the water, and sometimes you can. And I was thinking, what an interesting solution to the problem, because it's not a page where you're forced to read it. It's a place that you have an opportunity to read it, but he's architecturalized a moment of it's coming into memory or not coming into memory. That's what's suggested to me by the video. Is that right? Or is that just convenience? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean,
So as if the water would let you sometimes see the messages clearly, but not like it's written on the thing, a page that everybody walks from one to one another, and by the end of it they say, oh my God.
Yeah. So, I mean, the question of readership is an important one. Can you read architecture? And can you read it in your home? Can you read it in the public realm? Can you read it in a classroom? Right? And so, interestingly, they said, well, we can talk about rape in the context of the classroom where we know what everyone's frame of reference is. And so, in a college setting, we can talk about rape, and that's fine. But in the public realm, if you have your young child with you, and you want to get a rape part of the system, and so there is a context in which these words are appropriate, and maybe there's a context in which they're inappropriate. So the question is, does the architecture occlude it or produce a kind of variable interface? It's an interesting one. Maybe the Board of Visitors would feel better knowing that it wasn't entirely legible all the time, or that the kind of optics of the water would change, and so...
But that's not what you intended to produce in the video.
That was kind of accidental.
It's nice to have a critic like me.
But I think we learned a lot by talking to them and saying, when would it be acceptable to use a rape? And I'm sure that from the Board of Visitors, they don't think it's acceptable.
No.
Because it's out there in the open, anyone can read it. What are they going to think about us? Our students raped slave girls. How horrible. Well, that's the history, that's the record. And so, how do we confront that difficult, nasty history in an honest way? These are kind of extra architectural questions. But
Do you have a lawyer? I mean, let's let this in. Discuss it.
Okay. Anybody else have thoughts? It's a heavy way to